Hi, all. I'm Steve Allaire. I teach immigration law at Cornell Law School, where I co-direct an asylum clinic and also direct a clinic helping Afghans at risk. That's a photo of Cornell Law School in the background there. And it is snowing today, unfortunately. We're here today to discuss the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. Recent events have focused on Ukraine, but the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan is even worse. There are 2.6 million registered Afghan refugees in the world. Another 3.5 million Afghans are internally displaced, having fled their homes searching for refuge within the country. After the fall of the Afghan government last August, the United States evacuated over 100,000 Afghans to the United States or third countries. Yet an estimated 200,000 Afghan allies who helped the US military or government remain in Afghanistan, fearing persecution and famine. Moreover, those who have made it to the United States have mostly entered on something called humanitarian parole, which is a temporary status that expires after 2 years. They need ways to remain in the United States permanently. Today, we're going to discuss what the United States, Cornell University, and other organizations have done to assist Afghans at risk, what remains to be done, and how you can help. We have an expert panel here to explain the situation, and I'll introduce them in alphabetical order. First, Nell Katie Cruz. Nell is an independent director at Barclays US and Barclays Bank Delaware. She's also on the advisory board of No One Left Behind, a nonprofit assisting special immigrant visa holders who worked alongside US troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. Nell joined the Evacuate Our Allies Coalition in August of 2021 and helped to establish the Evacuate Our Allies Operations Center, which acts as a central information and coordination hub to assist with cases and connect coalition members to trusted resources. Next is Joel Kelsey, who's Chief of Staff to Senator Richard Blumenthal. Joel advises Senator Blumenthal on everything, but particularly for today's purposes, the senator's work on the Armed Services and Veterans Affairs Committees. Joel's been very active on Afghan-related legislation. We also have Camille Mackler, who is Executive Director and founder of the Immigrant Advocates Response Collaborative, and also a senior visiting fellow at the Truman Center for National Policy, where she's working on researching and highlighting intersections between immigration policy, national security, and foreign relations. We also have Chris Purdy, who is Director of Veterans for American Ideals and Outreach at Human Rights First, where he's helped to coordinate national efforts to assist Afghans at risk. And finally, we have Katie Ramlow, a Cornell Law student who has done many cases on behalf of Afghans at risk. We've got a lot of questions coming in already, and if you want to ask questions, just click the dialog box at the top right of your video player. Throughout our discussion, we'll share URLs and resources in the chat, so heads up for those. And if you're going to be watching this via the archived recording, those links are going to be available in the overview section just below. We've got lots of questions, so let's jump right in. Chris, why don't you start and remind our attendees what happened in Afghanistan last year?
Thanks, Steve, and thanks, Cornell, for having us here. This is a really important topic of conversation, and especially given we just passed the 6-month anniversary of the Fall of Kabul. It's an important moment for us to remember this. What happened in August, a lot of us kind of think of this as a single event, but really we saw this happen throughout the entire summer and leading up to August 14th, which was the day that the elected government of Afghanistan fell. The president and senior leaders fled, and the city of Kabul entered into the hands of the Taliban. On August 14th or 15th, thereabouts, the U.S. established a security perimeter around the airport, the Hamid Karzai International Airport, HKIA, as it was known to many of us for those few days and weeks. And we immediately started figuring out ways to get our Afghan allies who had been left behind as a result of the Taliban takeover, getting them through the gate and onto the airfield and onto safe passage flights to third countries and eventually for many of them in the United States. It was a really difficult time for a lot of us. Camille and I and others had been working on trying to preemptively evacuate Afghanistan. We've been seeing this writing on the wall for weeks and months, and desperately trying to have people listen to us, and to see this that collapse happen so spectacularly. It had a real traumatic event on the effect on the advocates, but also we can't forget those really horrible pictures of people climbing on planes trying to get out. It was a difficult time.
Camille, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think just maybe to continue the story that Chris started with, what happened once individuals got here. So about, I think, and Chris, please correct me if I'm wrong, I think 76,000 Afghans so far made it in the NEO and the non-combatant evacuation operation, the civilian-led evacuation effort that happened. And they arrived in the United States, and it was utter chaos at Dulles Airport. They were all funneled through Dulles Airport initially, where the Department of Homeland Security, Customs Border Protection, CBP, sort of had to stand up very quickly vetting mechanisms because of the way in which they had been brought out of the United States, brought out of Afghanistan into the United States. And it resulted in days-long waits for folks on the tarmac in the planes. And then they sort of slowly but surely got a system put together and were transferred to bases here in the United States, where they spent months, the so-called safe havens, where they spent months living in these facilities, in these DOD facilities, waiting to be processed for refugee resettlement, and then eventually put through the refugee resettlement pipeline. And I'm sort of saying this to set up the further conversation, because that sort of way of processing them into the United States has ended up creating so many issues down the road, and has led to so much advocacy efforts that we're still working on right now, and is a big reason why this situation isn't going away anytime soon. But they went through the refugee resettlement process, going through the agencies, which had been gutted under the previous White House administration. They lost a lot of resources. They're not meant to handle these kinds of cases. They're not meant to handle cases of individuals who are here with no legal status. And it's created housing shortages. It's creating immense backlogs. And so those are sort of all of the issues that we're continuing to deal with today. And so for a lot of these individuals, the trauma is not over. The fight to resettle is not over. And of course, now as all eyes turn to Ukraine, we're still here trying to, help these individuals who are safe for now, but still struggling in many ways.
And Joel, from Congress's perspective, you jumped right into the action in August. Can you tell us a little bit about what you all and other staffers did to try to help the situation?
Sure. One thing that I would first add to the excellent answers is, in between the immense challenges of getting people out of Afghanistan and then here to the United States, a lot of them went through Qatar. Several of them, however, also went to a different kind of third country. There's about 10,000 still in Abu Dhabi, many in Albania, some in Mexico, some in Rwanda, and kind of, throughout the world. And those folks are still being processed now for hopeful eventual resettlement in the United States, or onto other countries. So that's one important piece to think about as we continue the efforts to help our allies. For our part in Congress, in August of 2021, we passed a bill that gave about $10 million in emergency funds for 2021 that would help Americans kind of with basic necessities to provide folks when they were resettling here. In September, we signed a continuing resolution that allocated about $6 billion to resettle those up to 95,000. We're at, as Camille mentioned, I think about 75 right now. That will be continued assistance for those folks as they resettle here in the United States. So that's a good first step. But I think from my boss's perspective and our perspective, there's much, much more we need to be doing, both to help get people out of Afghanistan, and then also helping all of the resettlement agencies here in the United States as they make their way here and we start to look for longer term solutions for them.
Great. Next, I want to ask a little more specifically about what each of your organizations did to help Afghans at risk leave Afghanistan last summer. Now, let me start with you, because you helped to set up the operations center at this organization called Evacuate Our Allies. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about Evacuate Our Allies generally and what the Operations Center does.
Okay. Evacuate Our Allies is a coalition of a number of groups, and it included and is led by Chris Purdy and Camille and Colonel Steve Miska, a fellow Cornellian, who unfortunately couldn't make it here. I worked with Steve in August to set up what we called the Operations Center, which is really a conduit to communicate and provide the best information and connections to trusted sources from cases originating out of the groups who are in the coalition, which include, immigrant advocates, faith-based groups, civil rights groups, et cetera, and to connect those cases with, as some people may recall, there were all these sort of pop-up grassroots active action people who were all of a sudden there in Afghanistan and Kabul helping to get people out or to get people to safety. And so there's another group which is called Afghan EVAC, and that is a coalition of the many, many groups who started sometimes with 2 or 3 guys, usually guys, but not all. And they were working to evacuate people. And you didn't have a good way to connect between the cases and the people in the groups that were part of the Evacuate Our Allies coalition. So we were that conduit or the hub of that, and it was very, very helpful. We're still operating almost 24/7, 7 days a week, and the activities that we did then are not hugely different, but literally we would have calls about this person or this family, mainly family groups, and we would connect them to someone who could get them out when that was still an option. And after that, it became getting them to safe houses or safe housing situations. And now we're still answering the phone and WhatsApp and Signal, helping get the people, the hundreds of thousands of people, but in terms of who we interact with, it's fewer than that, but helping them get firewood, fuel, food, places of safety, et cetera. So there's still, I just do want to point out, there's still huge numbers of people still in Afghanistan who couldn't get out, who have every right to come to the United States and in many cases other countries as well. So that's what the Operations Center was set up to do. We set it up in about 48 hours and staffed it up with some amazing people. And we have about 24 people still there now who are taking care of keeping those connections going.
Chris, do you want to add anything to that in terms of what Human Rights First and other groups did to actually get people out of Afghanistan?
Yeah, it was a wild time, to say the least. Steve, actually, Colonel Miska, kept calling me and he's like, I think someone should set up a operations center. I think someone should do that. And I was like, yeah, Steve, someone should do that. And so he that initiative that he and Nell showed was greatly appreciated. On our end, I'll just kind of the chronology of everything. August 14th was a Saturday. At that point, we had been working 6 months nonstop. I mean, I think my wife was 8 months pregnant, and she was like, "Can you just take some time to maybe have a family weekend?" And so I said, "All right, we're gonna just kind of hang out on Saturday." Of course, my phone is blowing up. I'm ignoring it. Phone is blowing up, ignoring it. It's the State Department calling, saying, "Hey, Kabul is falling now. We need to get people out." So I was like, "Okay, what do we have to do here?" So I sat down with some of our coalition partners, started working with them and the State Department to getting a list together of Afghans in need who worked for NGOs in the Kabul area that we knew could get on a flight. that list turned into a form that you could sign online, so we could distribute to more NGOs. Eventually, congressional offices started reaching out to us saying, hey, we have people in country. All the while, we're funneling this right to the State Department through our personal contacts, people that I had worked with privately before. There was nothing set up, and this is how it was done for the first few days and weeks of the evacuation. We eventually ended up getting a list of almost 200,000 individuals when it was all said and done about a month later. Now, many of those folks, unfortunately, didn't get out. And it was really, Nell mentioned that there are still a lot of people left behind, and people on that list are still there. But we worked really hard those few weeks in August to ensure that people who were on that list were seen by the State Department, that they got on flights. If they didn't get on flights, that there was a plan for them. Nell also mentioned Afghan Evac, which is a sister coalition that we're very close with. The leaders of that coalition started off trying to coordinate landing rights to get charter planes in. If you remember, there was a lot of interest in trying to organize and donate to charter planes to fly in and get people out. Well, those, there's logistics that need to happen there. And so we had some really smart people sit down and they asked Camille and myself and a couple other folks from Evacuator Allies to help think through the immigration pathways that would be needed. That coalition continues to this day, as I mentioned, to continue to provide safe passage flights as much as possible. But we were really at every stage outside of as an organization or as a coalition, directly pulling people through the wire. Now, myself and other people did have those phone calls with families and helped guiding them through checkpoints and really difficult conversations. I remember, we were able to secure travel, a bus from a woman's home for herself, her two children, and her nephew. They were supposed to, the bus driver was supposed to bring them right to the gate. We were supposed to talk to the Marine at the gate, and we were going to let them through. That was the plan. Well, about halfway through that plan, the bus driver kicked them out into, if you guys might have seen some of the pictures, there was a water ditch around HKIA. And she called me not knowing what to do. Her husband's here in Atlanta, kind of arguing with me. And I'm like, so we were eventually able to get them through the gate, but lots of stories like that. And unfortunately, lots more that we weren't successful. So really, we were involved at every level.
And Joel, speaking of charter flights, I know you and Senator Blumenthal got some people out on charter flights. Why don't you tell us a little bit about those?
Sure. Yeah. Our experience, I think, very much matched a lot of what you've all heard. Early on, the senator started with a bipartisan group of folks going to the White House in April of 2020, and I think reinforcing a lot of the urgency that all of the groups represented here had been telling them, which is we need to act quickly and we need to get our allies out while we still can. So when Kabul eventually fell in August, we experienced the same kind of, I think, chaotic on the ground situation that you all have heard about. And for us, it's both, Steve, you mentioned my boss sits on the Veterans Affairs Committee as well as the Armed Services Committee. So there's a policy angle, but it's also very personal, both for my boss who had two sons who served, one in Afghanistan, the other was a Navy SEAL. We have lots of staff here in the office who are current active duty military, a lot of veterans that are both current and former staff here. And so we're hearing from a lot of the folks that they knew and a lot of their networks back in Afghanistan. And that's in addition to all of the casework coming into us that I think Chris mentioned, hearing from congressional offices. So we were in the fortunate position of being in contact along with, just like you kind of all heard here, with a lot of the folks on the ground there. So early on, we started funneling some of the casework into buses to get them through the gates. We got a number of buses through early on in August, and those folks were, flown out and eventually landed in Dulles and resettled here. But towards the end, those buses, the gates were opening less and less frequently, and a number of our buses didn't make it through. So in the end, we had a caravan of many people, hundreds, about 650 at that time. And we made the pivot from Kabul, from HKIA, as the doors were closing, up to Mazar-e Sharif in the north of the country. And we're able to luckily partner with a number of NGOs and news outfits and organizations, and just kind of a network of people that were stitched together, much the way that I think a lot of you experienced. And we're able to try to work through the State Department and DOD, along with the folks on the ground in Afghanistan and the Qataris, to fly. For us, it was 2 planes of 789 people from Mazar to Qatar, one in the end of September and the second in the beginning of October. So we were very involved in those, in kind of the entire arc of the situation in Afghanistan, and continue to be, although, as I think all of you, and we'll talk about soon, the pipeline has narrowed significantly. And so our efforts are both on trying to expand that, but also on helping with resettlement and some of the immigration issues that these folks run into, in order to make a smoother process that can get more of our allies out more quickly.
That's a good segue. Chris talked about the logistics involved, and you mentioned the immigration issues involved. Camille, why don't you talk about, how do we get these people legally into the United States? Their normal refugee process is very backlogged. It can take 2 or 3 years to go through normal background screening mechanisms. What did you and others do to try to expedite their ability to come in a legal way?
Yeah. It's a great question, because this crisis, I think, really highlighted for a lot of folks just the complete failures and limitations of our existing immigration system, and just a system that both relies almost exclusively on protection pathways for many people to come to the United States, and at the same time was completely, utterly lacking in the ability to provide protection in a moment of crisis. Initially, and I hope that you'll be pivoting to Katie next to talk a little bit about the work that Cornell did on this, but there were a lot of applications filed for humanitarian parole. So humanitarian parole is not a status. Parole is a legal fiction by which you're allowed to physically enter the United States without being legally admitted into the United States, meaning that you're permitted to enter, but you don't actually have immigration status. You are protected from deportation. Those who made it on the evacuation flights were given 2-year grants of humanitarian parole. They were given work authorization cards as well. For everybody else who is left out of the country, there is an application process by which you can affirmatively ask for this from the U.S. government. It's a very limited form of immigration benefit. It's rarely granted, and it's done in very, very small numbers in typical years. And this, and in the absence of any other option, the refugee process, as you mentioned, for those who can make it physically to the United States, there's asylum. There's potentially other avenues for relief, family-based petitions and such. But for the vast majority of people asking affirmatively for humanitarian parole, which is what was being granted to individuals who were evacuated here, was really the only option. And so the applications sort of blew up and ended up in the tens of thousands. And we now have this huge backlog of cases. The U.S. government has, the Department of Homeland Security has made all sorts of, decisions. They've adopted very narrow interpretations of who can qualify for humanitarian parole. They've been pretty clear that they won't adjudicate applications for anyone who filed from within Afghanistan, since there's no mechanism to actually get them the paperwork to leave Afghanistan if they were granted. And so they've just basically decided to ignore those applications. And at the end of the day, it doesn't really solve the long-term problem, particularly for those who want to stay. And I think the other issue that we ran into, and Chris, you could probably speak more to this than I can because of your more direct contact with folks there, but our immigration laws define family so narrowly that there were a lot of times when, individuals like an SIV applicant, a special immigrant visa applicant, which is a visa for individuals who served as interpreters for our troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, they might be able to qualify for that visa and bring their spouse and children, but they're leaving behind their parents, their siblings, other family members who we would all consider our family, right? And those are very difficult choices to make, and very often folks chose not to leave unless they could leave with everyone. So humanitarian parole, I'm sure we'll get to the sort of the ongoing fight around that and the Afghan Adjustment Act in a little bit, but that was really principally, I think, the one tool that folks were applying for. My organization, Immigrant ARC, in conjunction with many other places, have developed screening tools to try to identify ways for Afghans who might be able to use other parts of the immigration system, employment-based or academic-based petitions, for example, to travel to the United States. We've had some success, very limited. What's been really overwhelming about the situation is the sheer amount of hours and people and connections and strings that you pull for one case, for one individual, for one family. In immigration, generally, we've been used to sort of, having to fight very, very hard fights, right? But when we were successful, whatever degree of success we had, they impact a great group of people. Deferred action for childhood arrivals as one example. In this instance, you're just fighting so hard for one person, which, it's a starfish theory of change. It's obviously important to do, but it's just over and over and over again, trying to find the one little niche area of immigration law that we might be able to use.
Katie, let me turn to you because you filed several humanitarian parole applications in the fall. Why don't you give us an example of how hard you had to fight just to get the application filed and where the case stands now?
Sure. So here at Cornell, we filed over 40 petitions for humanitarian parole, and most of our efforts have been focused on folks who are still in Afghanistan or in third countries who were not lucky enough to make it out this summer during the evacuation. And so our clients are still waiting to hear either way if they can come to the U.S. Our first case we filed was back in October, and we haven't heard on any of our cases yet whether anyone's been approved or disapproved. The amount of paperwork that's required for just one individual is pretty significant. The applications are often over 100 pages, and you have to file an application for each member of a family, even for a child. And so it's the effort to do an application for an entire family is significant, and you do everything from helping them gather the many documents that they have. Some folks don't have access to the documents. We need translations of national identity documents from Afghanistan into English to submit, and we help them fill out the paperwork themselves. And we also help line up financial sponsors. A piece of getting approval for humanitarian parole is to show that the person applying either themselves has the resources to support themselves in the U.S. if they're able to come, or that they have somebody here who's willing to make that commitment to help support them. And so we had dozens of students and still continue students working on these cases to help as many people as we can.
Great. Let's transition now. A lot of these people who did come into the United States came in on some kind of parole process, which is temporary and only for 2 years. What are some of the options that allow them to stay permanently in the United States? Katie, why don't we start with you again, because you're working on some asylum cases in our clinic.
So yes, we're for the first time doing an asylum clinic here at Cornell focused just on Afghan clients. And we're drawing on the years of experience that Steve and other professors here at Cornell have done with asylum. And I'm a student in this clinic, and my classmates and I are each working on one asylum application for one applicant. And it really does take the entire semester to do this. The paperwork and the amount of research involved is even more than a humanitarian parole application. And so we meet with our clients every week to go through their background, to gather documents, and to help them make the best case possible to apply for asylum. Unfortunately, our clinic and other legal clinics at law schools are relatively small, and we have only so much bandwidth. And so these efforts aren't really a replacement for the larger scale policy solutions that I think the other panelists here can talk about. But we try to do our small part where we can.
And that's a good segue to you, Joel. I mean, all these existing green card categories are individual, case-specific ones. What can Congress do to help Afghans more generally? For example, there's this legislation that's been floating around called the Afghan Adjustment Act. What would that do if it were to be passed?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just real quick before I answer to frame, there's two kind of major issues that we've been kind of touching on. One is what is the correct possible legal pathway from those still in Afghanistan to the United States? We've heard a lot about the SIV program for our allies that assisted as interpreters with the United States government and our military. It's important to remember those are mostly men. The family definition around SIV, as was mentioned, is extremely narrow. As Camille mentioned, we would consider lots of folks to be family. The Taliban considers lots of folks to be family that our immigration law does not. So when we're thinking about getting folks out of Afghanistan, both the SIV program, making adjustments to the P1 and P2, which other folks can talk about, priority status for those that helped NGOs, for women in particular that tried to stand up educational institutions in Afghanistan for women and girls, extremely important. And then also the 75,000 and up to 95,000 that will be resettled here, providing something that's more than just a temporary humanitarian parole application, humanitarian parole status to them is extremely important. So the Afghan Adjustment Act would provide a pathway to legal protected, to an LPR, to a green card for those who are here after they've been here for a certain amount of time, and they go through a process. There's also legislation that is, and these are both very live topics right now before Congress. We hope to have a breakthrough soon. There's also legislation that would expand some of the pathways for folks in Afghanistan, our allies in Afghanistan, for example, special operators that worked in the Afghan National Army that worked with our armed forces, family members of United States military members who are in Afghanistan. There's several naturalized U.S. citizens who are in our military now, but whose family is in Afghanistan and are targets of the Taliban. So providing them with a pathway, and others as well that count as our allies. So thinking of kind of both of those things and trying to get Congress to act to expand both the legal pathways here from Afghanistan, but also provide a more stable, certain, and long-term solution for those that have been able to make it here.
And Joel, from a policy perspective, what happens if we don't help our Afghan allies?
That's a great question. Nothing good. I think one important thing that we've talked about a lot here, and that my boss has talked about, is that the world, as we know, is watching. And we have men and women in uniform all across the world who rely heavily on people in the countries that they're deployed in to be interpreters, to be kind of cultural translators for them. And if those folks believe that we will strand them behind, then it puts our men and women in uniform in those places in jeopardy, because trust is a very important component of that relationship. And what we do in Afghanistan and how we treat our allies that are stranded there has a lot of implications and ramifications across the world, national security implications for our men and women in uniform. So it's important to keep that in mind and remember that because of that, the stakes are really high for us. And not to mention, obviously, the stakes are life and death for those that are still in Afghanistan.
Chris, let's go back to those who did make it to the United States. There are a lot of resettlement issues that are facing them. What's going on with trying to get them established in the United States, and what are you and other groups doing?
Yeah, well, so I think the biggest crisis that we're facing of folks who have gone through the safe havens, and like many Americans have tried to find housing, and it's been more expensive. And the housing that is that the Afghans are unfortunately being placed in through resettlement agencies is quite frankly subpar. At Vets for American Ideals, we have veterans in every major city that are facing this issue directly, dealing with their local resettlement agency. I had a veteran out of Boston call me up and said, "Chris, I can't find housing that's good enough for these Afghans. I'm going to have to buy a home for these people." And so, at least the last time I spoke to him, he was planning on trying to through his own personal finances to purchase a separate home. Another veteran in St. Louis is constantly dealing or helping Afghans who have been resettled with broken pipes. And moldy, mold in the homes, just places where we wouldn't ourselves want to live, much less put our friends and allies in. And so, the solution, well, I think there's some supply issues with our economy that needs to be fixed. But really what Joel said about the Afghan Adjustment Act is really critical, because if we can put these people on a pathway to legal permanent residency, it gives them permanence. It allows them to put down roots in a place and not be dependent on the generosity of really great work that's being done at resettlement agencies. And it also has the ancillary benefit to your previous question of opening up the pipeline for folks in the SIV process. And so I'll just hit that real quick and say, for every SIV case that we can adjudicate through an Afghan Adjustment Act, we can then use those resources to help people that have been left behind in Afghanistan. So really what we see as the solution here is to getting the people who have been put in the United States, getting them on a pathway to legal permanent residency as quickly as possible, so that they can really take the initiatives for themselves and not have to worry about being dependent on overtaxed and overworked refugee resettlement agencies that are really doing the best that they can, but just in this current environment is very difficult.
Camille, why don't you talk a little bit about what IARC is doing to try to help people resettle? For example, I'm familiar with what they're doing in upstate New York, but they're working throughout New York State and elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. So IARC is a coalition of legal service providers throughout New York. We're actually working mainly in upstate with Afghan communities, because that's where the bulk of Afghans have been resettled. So far, we've had very few down here in New York City or on Long Island. And we've been trying to coordinate services. So we've been organizing clinics, and we've been helping organize clinics in Albany, legal intake clinics. In Albany, we've screened almost all of the Afghan families actually that have arrived in the capital region of New York. We've been helping set up some similarly in Rochester, supporting efforts in Syracuse and other places. We've been doing trainings for our legal service providers on the different intake mechanisms that we have and the different kinds of laws that they should be looking for. We've been trying to connect pro bono attorneys or attorneys looking for pro bono opportunities to the right places, particularly sort of taking the resources, that the significant pro bono resources down here in New York City, and connecting them to providers upstate who need that help. And we're currently in the middle of doing a needs assessment. So we have a project coordinator specifically for our Afghan work. She's Afghan herself. She was evacuated as part of the NEO last August, and she's working with groups nationally and also groups here in New York to sort of do a needs assessment so that we can get a more robust understanding of what the actual needs on the ground are for Afghans who are coming to New York. We know housing, we know language. Obviously, we're trying to assess what the legal needs are. So far through our clinical work, we've seen that it's really mainly humanitarian-based options. A lot of asylum applications, some special immigrant visas, some special immigrant juvenile status for those who arrived who are under 21 years old. Some family-based petitions. We're also trying to identify those, like I said earlier, who may be able to petition through employers or through academia or anything like that. But just basically trying to help as many Afghans have a long-term future. I do want to note that a lot of individuals, our experience has been, don't actually want to stay. They want to go back, and they hope that they'll be able to go back. I say a lot. I shouldn't say a lot. And so there's sort of this tension between understanding that they have to be able to remain here long-term, but also dealing with the trauma of having been uprooted the way that they were. And the reality is that they probably can't go back. At least not for quite a long time. And so just sort of trying to make sure that we're providing all those services. We are a legal service coordinating organization, but legal services is a lot more than just lawyers. We need social workers, we need case managers, we need the community groups that spring up. Working with the veteran community has been amazing. Seeing how they've responded to this and how they, Chris just gave 2 incredible examples, but it goes so much beyond that. And we're just trying to sort of make sure that everyone's brought together and working together to support our new neighbors here in New York and help them get through this moment.
Great. Next, let's transition to how we're going to try to help other people who are still in Afghanistan or in so-called lily pad countries actually get to the United States. Now, let me start with you and tell me what Evacuate Our Allies is doing, and then I'll ask Chris and Camille to chime in.
Okay. Yeah, I think that I think it's a very good question. And remember, Evacuate Our Allies is a coalition of a whole number of different groups. And I think Chris can probably discuss that in greater detail. But we are seeing organizations and cases that come from each one of these organizations. For example, American Wartime Allies to Human Rights First and others who have, everyone is on a Signal or WhatsApp chat and other means of communications with people who are cases, meaning families who are still in Afghanistan. And as I monitor these and see what the requests are, it tends to be, these are families still stuck. They're often in safe housing, or they're somewhere. Safe is an overstatement. Even almost none of these people are really truly safe, and they all feel in great danger. But they are working to get things like passports, get their paperwork together, figure out a way, and weigh should they try to sneak out and end up in Pakistan. And the answer is that's really a dangerous problem. And so I think it's good probably for Chris to comment, but this is a daily times thousands, tens of thousands of people struggling to try to figure out what to do. And what we help with is intelligence on the ground. Like, here's how you can get some money. The services, I'm drawing a blank on the wire transfer services, but they're open today. You can get $25, this sort of thing, we can get you some firewood. Where are you? Or, this sort of thing. So it's literally, it feels like hand-to-hand combat, case by case, family by family, and everyone is in under extreme duress and threatened. So the daily barrage that all of the members of the coalition seem to get is people saying, I can't go out. I haven't been able to go out of my basement for 6 months, this kind of thing. And so, sorry, I don't have a great answer for this. I think I should turn it over to Chris. Maybe he's more optimistic.
I think that analogy of hand-to-hand combat is apt. And I think, the other thing that strikes me is I'm sure everyone on this call receives emails. I know I do. Emails, WhatsApp messages, LinkedIn messages, Facebook messages from Afghans who've been left behind. They've found out who the helpers are, and they're asking desperately for our help. And the sad reality is I have no good news to give them. And we continue to work with our State Department and DHS and NSC partners. Those programmatic folks are diligent, and they are working very hard. But it is a political reality that this administration wants to see Afghanistan in the rearview mirror, And so the resources that we've been asking for are not there. We've painted a picture here today of two coalitions that are bringing together whole of society responses to this. And we still, struggle to have a whole of government response mirroring, that engagement. So, yes, we meet with the State Department and the NSC and the DHS weekly and monthly, and they give us programmatic updates. And we're very, the people that work in government, I cannot tell you how good these people are. They care, but it is a political problem. And so what we really need right now is for this administration to take this problem seriously and not view it political, view it as the humanitarian crisis, the responsibility this country has to our allies. I think we're seeing an amazing response to the refugee crisis unfolding in Ukraine. And what we would like to see is the same outpouring of support for our Ukrainian friends be afforded to our Afghan allies, right? Visa-less travel is being opened up to Canada and parts of Europe. People countries opening their arms. And lots of folks on here have explained that there are still millions, hundreds of thousands of people who fought alongside our soldiers and alongside our government, in Afghanistan, feel abandoned. And that's really the hard truth. So, I think I've kind of gone on a bit of a tangent here, so I'll kind of pull back.
It's not a tangent at all. And before we get to questions, we have some good questions. Let's sort of try to end on a positive note of what can the public do to help Afghan allies. And we've got a screenshot here of different organizations. Chris or Camille, why don't you start with Evacuate Our Allies Coalition or No One Left Behind, and sort of talk about your organizations and how people could connect with them. Camille?
Sure. I mean, I think first and foremost, pushing for the introduction and passage of the Afghan Adjustment Act is critical. We have to give these individuals the confidence that they have stability and a way forward. And certainly that's what I've heard from our Afghan communities and our Afghan partners, that they're looking for a sort of a reassurance that the journey part of this saga is over, and that they can really focus on resettlement. I think for more concrete action, if you're in New York, you're an attorney, you're looking to get involved, certainly feel free to contact IARC. We're on social media, Immigrant ARC, or through our website, through our contact form. We actually have an Afghan page there as well. And for other parts of the country, Human Rights First has been really coordinating legal services nationally. IARC participates in those efforts and takes on the New York side of things. But nationally, I know Human Rights First is always looking for additional pro bono attorneys wherever who can help. And their PALA, Project Afghan Legal Assistance, did I get it right? Which is also on their website, is doing incredible work. As many folks may or may not know, on this webinar, there's no guaranteed right to legal representation in immigration. And more often than not, individuals are either must find a nonprofit who can help them, or get private counsel, or muddle through a very, very complicated system on their own without any assistance. And of course, for Afghans whose assets and finances are still frozen, it's quite difficult to be able to hire attorneys right now. So any support you can give to efforts like that, I think, is very important. If you're not an attorney or you're looking to help in other ways, connect to your local veteran groups that are trying to support these efforts. Connect to your local refugee resettlement agencies who are looking to, they're always looking for donations. I know the resettlement agencies, housing is the biggest need right now, but even once you find housing, you have to furnish it. You have to, get clothing. You have to all sorts of things like that. There's been a lot of really great community-based grassroots efforts to meet those needs. And I think that that's a really, really great way to get involved. And I just kind of want to echo something Chris said earlier, which is don't forget, right? There's so much other news going on right now. This is kind of old news at this point. I know, although people keep telling me it's not in the news anymore, and I keep saying I don't know what you're talking about, because it's all I spent my day doing, like every single day for the past year. But don't forget that this happened, and don't forget that we could have avoided it if only people had listened. Chris and I know that from very deep personal experience. So we have to make sure that this doesn't happen again. We saw it happen after Vietnam, and now we saw it happen in Afghanistan, and the next generation cannot live through this. So don't forget, and help us push for better immigration laws, help us push for more welcoming policies at the local level, at the national level. Whatever that looks like, get involved.
So now next I'll ask you about No One Left Behind, and then Joel, I'll ask you after that about what people can do to try to motivate Congress to enact some of these more systemic changes.
Oh, thank you. No One Left Behind, I'll make this brief. No One Left Behind was founded in order to help the special immigrant visa holders who are, have just made it here. They started even with a welcome at the airport, kind of a hero's welcome. And then the most important thing is once these interpreters or special immigrant visa holders land in the U.S., they need, as Camille just said, they need housing. They need jobs, and a very common job. They also need a car, and a common job is a driver, Uber, this sort of thing. So No One Left Behind works with Starbucks and Uber and Lyft and other places. They work to help car financing. They've made a number of grants, quite a lot of grants, and now interest-free loans for people, for these special immigrant visa holders to buy cars so that they can then, transport family members as well as find jobs, either get to the job or use the car as their job. So I think in the last month alone, No One Left Behind has distributed $400,000 to newly landed or just processed special immigrant visa holders. So there's a lot of need out there, huge needs across the board. It's the same thing. And if people want to help, they can go to the No One Left Behind website, which is nooneleft.org. I think you have it in there. And that's another place that could absolutely use support for helping these people.
And Joel, what can people do to try to influence members of Congress to be more proactive and fund more money on this issue?
Thanks. I would. It's not just my colleagues here in Congress that need to hear this message, but as Chris mentioned, also the administration, that not nearly enough is being done to help folks get out of Afghanistan. I think it's important to, whatever has happened in the past and however many years and whatever missteps led us to this place, it's not too late to help people get out. And it's important for people to remember that and deliver a very clear message, both to my colleagues here in Congress, but also to the administration, that the reason these people are in danger is because they helped us, or they tried to help fight for a more free, inclusive, and democratic country for themselves. And in that way, they're not much different than those in Ukraine. And so it's not just the right thing to do, it's a moral obligation that our country has. And so remind any of your elected leaders of that, and remind anyone who you can in the administration of that as well. Whatever got us here, we have an opportunity to do more than just get a couple hundred out a week. And we have an obligation to meet that. I'd leave it there, I guess. Thank you.
Great. Well, we've got a lot of questions. And Katie, let me start with you. Someone asked a question about asylum. For people who did enter on humanitarian parole, A, can they apply for asylum? And B, is it somehow easier for them than a normal asylum application?
They can apply for asylum. And in terms of applying, there was legislation passed this fall that helped to kind of set up a framework to expedite the process for Afghan citizens that seems to be applied both to those who made it prior to August and those who came on humanitarian parole. And so what we're trying to do is to help people be prepared to file their asylum applications as quickly as possible. But these cases are only just starting to move through the asylum pipeline. And so it's hard to draw too many conclusions at this point in terms of how often they're being approved or how they're being handled. But we're doing the best we can to kind of use lessons learned from other asylum cases and from what we know about how the asylum process works to set people up for success in filing good applications and being ready for the interview process.
And I'll add to that from our asylum clinic and from my experience on asylum generally, these are the same requirements for Afghans to be eligible for asylum as for anyone else. And there are two issues that frequently pop up. One is whether the individual applying for asylum has done anything that would be related to terrorism. These are called TRIG for short, or terrorism-related inadmissibility grounds. And there's been some concern among advocates that USCIS asylum officers are probing Afghan asylum applicants very carefully to try to make sure that they have not inadvertently helped the Taliban in any way. And I've heard reports about some Afghan asylum applicants being quizzed by asylum officers for up to 4 to 6 hours in their interviews on these issues. So it's not any easier for people to qualify for asylum because you came from Afghanistan or you entered on humanitarian parole than it is for anyone else. So we need more good people to go to law school and become asylum lawyers, like I hope Katie will when she graduates. Second often question that asked is that another requirement of asylum is that you're supposed to apply for asylum within 1 year after you enter the United States. There are certain exceptions, but that's the general rule. And we had a question from someone whether the 1 year filing deadline for asylum claims will be extended. And Camille, you might want to add to this, but I have heard that informally USCIS has agreed that for those who have entered on humanitarian parole, they will have 2 years to qualify to apply for asylum, which gives them more time to prepare an excellent case that hopefully would be winning. For those Afghans who entered without humanitarian parole, they're subject to the normal 1 year filing deadline, and it would be up to either the administration or Congress to extend that for other Afghans. We had another question come in about whether any of us are working with Afghan judges or lawyers who are in the United States or who are trying to get to the United States. Camille, let me start with you on that one, because I know you've been working on some of those cases.
I haven't personally, but there are definitely efforts happening to help, I'd say, more specific groups of individuals who don't fall within the categories of protection that the U.S. government has identified as priorities, and judges and lawyers are a really good example. I know there's projects like Mina's List that are working with Afghan women generally. There are other projects that are working with female judges specifically because they're just at such high risk for retaliation from the Taliban. The National Endowment for Democracy is working on they call them Democrats in Exile, I believe, individuals who worked in government or academia or other sort of social science fields that are now at risk because they were sort of working to promote and to create and to shore up democratic institutions in Afghanistan, and are now targeted by the Taliban as a result of that. So there are definitely a lot of organizations. I did work with a fairly prominent women's rights activist and got her to the United States, actually with many other colleagues on a J-1 visa to continue her work here in the United States through Wellesley College. There's been other examples like that. Like I said earlier, each case is such an amazing investment. It's such an incredible investment of resource and time and, frankly, connections. It's hard to, there hasn't been a lot of ability to help groups as a whole.
Great. Well, we've got about 1 minute left. I'll go around and ask everybody to state one last comment or suggestion for the audience, and we'll go in alphabetical order again. So now let's start with you.
I guess I would echo what was said earlier, which is we can't let this happen again. And we have to put in place things we have to change the political scene in order to ensure that we don't do this again.
Joel?
I would agree with that, and just echo my earlier call to remember that we have a moral obligation to our allies in Afghanistan, and it's not just like any other country in the world. We spent 20 years there, and there's a lot of folks who owe their lives to Afghans who helped them, and we need to pay that debt. And it's not just now, but going into the future to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Camille?
I guess I'll say the same thing, but maybe a little bit more bluntly. It's time for our government leaders to show political courage. This is not the time to be playing politics. And we cannot let this happen again. This is 2 generations worth of failures at this point, and it has to end with this.
Chris?
Yeah, 2 things. Call your member of Congress to pass the Afghan Adjustment Act. We have an action alert on our website at Human Rights First. And then donate your time, talent, or treasure to your local resettlement agency. If you don't want to get out there and like you're like me, you're kind of an introvert, you don't want to go out and do things, just they'll take a check, and they appreciate that. So those are my 2 plugs.
Katie?
If you're a law student or a legal professional or aspiring legal professional, do immigration work, get involved, and it's one of the most meaningful ways you can get return on the education you're getting. So please do that.
Thank you, everyone. I hope that together we can still make a difference, both in Afghanistan and other refugee crises. We are all connected, but we can together make a difference. So with that, we'll leave it for today. And if anybody has any questions, you can email me at swy1@cornell.edu. Thanks, everyone.